This week on Dialogue, Stuck, Rwandan Youth and the Struggle for Adulthood. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our guests this week are Wilson Center fellow Mark Summers and Mamhadi Diouf. Mark Summers is a fellow at the Wilson Center's Africa program. He's also affiliated with the African Studies Center at Boston University. His newest book is this one, Stuck, Rwandan Youth and the Struggle for Adulthood. Mamhadi Diouf is a program associate with the Wilson Center Africa program and also with the Project on Leadership and Building State Capacity. I want to welcome both of you to Dialogue. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be here. Thank you.
I want to, Mark, begin with, before we dive into the content of the book, just about your interest in Africa. Before we came on the air, we were talking about the fact that Americans have a real challenge in understanding the rest of the world, and particularly when we turn to the African continent, there's a lot of ignorance.
Well, that's true. I mean, I don't know if it's ignorance or the attention just isn't there. The focus isn't really there on Africa. I think the way it's presented often in the media is as if it's a country. And so there is this reference to Africa as not as a continent, but as a place where there's the assumption that much of Africa is very similar. And in doing work in many parts of Africa, there are great, dramatic differences in different regions and even in different parts of the same country. And so that sort of variety, that sort of difference within Africa is often not represented in the media or I think in people's education of Africa.
It's an odd thing. I mean, the North American continent is large and the United States is large, and people could certainly understand the differences between, Georgia and California. But then when they apply it looking outward to the rest of the planet, not so much.
Yeah, it seems so. And I think it's hard for people to realize in a country such as Rwanda, which is about the size of, I believe it's Delaware. It's a very small place, that when you travel from one part of the country to the other, the dialects are different. They have different, there are different subcultures that are kind of dramatically different in different parts of the country. And we're not talking about a big place, on the map. But for Rwandans, going to other parts of the country, that's a big deal. Those people are like this kind of thing. So, it can happen in small parts
Geography
of
is destiny.
Yeah.
And about your particular interest in youth and youth recovering from violence, post-war.
Yeah, that started actually. I started working on that actually before there was kind of a field for it. I was looking at education during and after wars was the main research I was doing. But the way this sort of started was I ended up working with youth from Burundi who were hiding illegally in Dar es Salaam, and that became a book called Fear in Bongoland. And then in the Rwandan refugee camps right after the genocide, there was a realization that we had this meeting with international agency officials, sort of the heads of different sectors and so forth. And there was a realization in this one meeting that there was nothing for youth. There wasn't a soccer ball for youth. There was nothing for youth. There was primary schools, there were clinics for maternal and child health, all sorts of other things, but nothing for people who weren't in primary school, for young people. And so I was asked to start doing research on the situation of youth, not only in refugee camps, but then I went into Rwanda to take a look, and that's where it began. So this was started about a month after the genocide.
Mamhadi, I want to ask you about the upcoming conference. By the time our viewers and listeners see and hear this program, it will have happened, and we'll give you some information on how to find out more about some of the content that will happen that day as well. But tell us about the upcoming conference.
Indeed. We will be hosting a conference on April the 17th. and it's in conjunction with Mark here, and we've worked closely in order to come up with an agenda for that day. And the conference is entitled Youth in War and Post-War Africa, Priorities and Policies. And it will consist of two panels, one that will focus on the priorities and perspective of youth in this war and post-war Africa, and also one that, and we will have different panelists, experts and practitioners, basically, from universities and people who really focus on this topic. And Mark will be also a moderator, as well as Steve McDonald, director of the Africa program. And the second panel will focus on the policies and challenges of these youth, and also looking at donor policies, as well as decision makers, involving decision makers and opinion makers. And we'll have panelists such as people from the National Defense University, USAID, they are working on a youth policy. And as well as people from the World Bank. So it's going to be a very timely and important conference looking at this topic, and we are very excited about it.
And the demographics are compelling right now when you look at global populations. Just
Indeed.
What percentage of us, humans, are youth?
Youth, indeed.
Yeah. Speaking of, let's dive into the specifics of what you cover in the book, Mark. And how about a definition of youth in the context of Rwanda?
That's a good one. I mean, I think, according to the government, it's everybody between the ages of 14 and 35. But then there's the cultural definition of what a youth is, and that one I think is the more pertinent and important one, because it doesn't have to do with age. There are stages of between a youth is really the stage between childhood and becoming an adult. And the challenge in Rwanda, and where the title of the book comes from, is that so many youth aren't able to make that leap into adulthood because of these cultural expectations, prerequisites, mandates that they must accomplish. And it's increasingly difficult for them to do it. It's actually so serious that one of the findings of the book is that virtually an entire generation in Rwanda is going to be unable to their future looks like they're going to be failed adults.
Well, and this is tied to specific things, the definition of adult, this place that
Yes.
youth are trying to move into. What are those things?
Well, it starts with male youth. The first thing that a male youth has to do is build a house, and then the next step is to get married. And that a marriage, not a formal marriage, not an informal one, not an elopement, but one that takes place, in a wedding in a church or a mosque, a religious sort of ordained kind of one. A wedding that takes place that's witnessed by the community, and of course, if they're religious, by God. So, and then after that, the bride and groom have to have children, and the man, she's supposed to be in charge of the domestic duties, the household, and also farming, and he's expected, the young man, to be the provider. The problem in Rwanda is that male youth can't get off square one because they can't finish their house, and that has to do with poverty. That has to do with cultural prerequisites, the expectation. But more than anything else, it has to do with government regulations on housing. And the government regulations make it virtually impossible for most youth to ever finish their house. It's tragic.
On page, I wrote down the page number here, 202. Let me see here. Okay. Oh, good. I could have posted it in here as well. This was surprising to me, and I'm jumping around here. This is almost an end of the story in some ways, but you write that there was no evidence in the research data of young Rwandans creating alternative paths to adulthood by challenging these traditional and government-led definitions. I have to say that was a stunning statement to me. Especially in the age, and Mom Hadi, I'm willing to turn over the witness to you at any time during this prosecution. So please join in with your questions. But in the age of the internet and social media, where there's so much sharing across cultural lines, yet these young men and women are living under these old traditional definitions and not creating for themselves a new way out. Stunning.
Well, it is stunning, and it's not entirely specific to Rwanda, but you have a combination in Rwanda of a very unyielding culture connected with a government environment. I mean, a situation where the government is just as unyielding. So I think the combination of culture and government being so restrictive and controlling, both of them, makes it so difficult for young people. And there is, I think, a culture of being risk-averse, of avoiding difficulty, of avoiding risk. And so people, as they say in Rwanda, they go underground. There's resistance, but you do it quietly, behind the scenes. And so on the surface, the situation is that they're not challenging, and it is surprising. Now, to put that in contrast, in West Africa, there's a lot of challenging of that. And I think among elite Rwandans that there would be challenging of those. But with ordinary Rwandans, which would be 90% or more of all Rwandan youth, no. But I think in West Africa it's different.
No, I was just going to go on to piggyback on your question, which was it's also because it's marginalized youth, who do not have access to maybe those tools that you were just mentioning, internet, or who are more preoccupied, by making sure that they have access to money to be able to eat or survive. And I think when you are definitely on that train and you're trying to make sure that you make it through that day, there are certain things where challenging, as you said, there's culture, there's government, but you do not necessarily focus on that. You just try to make a living. And I think, as you said, there's definitely a difference between having, elite youth being able to also kind of pick up the quote-unquote grievances of the marginalized youth and putting it to the forefront, but that's not happening either in Rwanda.
What is the primary source of this loyalty or adherence to these traditional definitions and approaches? In other words, usually when you see this, there'll be some significant religious doctrine or dogma, or there's a source where this is handed down. What is the source within Rwandan culture that makes young people so loyal? Or is it the other side of the coin, the risk averseness that you talked about? Is it less about a strong, generationally handed down set of beliefs and more about this fear of change?
Well, Rwandan, the culture is, while you're building your house, that's the measure of your manhood.
So
how
masculinity
are you doing?
is tied into this.
Masculinity is very dominant here. And, there's a lot of talk, there has been a lot of talk about Rwandan widows and what happened after the genocide and how they helped each other. There hasn't been much talk about Rwandan widowers, and there are those as well. These guys, and I have met and interviewed some of these older men, without a wife, men don't help each other in the same way. What goes on in Rwandan society is, male youth will say, and even older men. I mean, people in their 30s, late 30s and 40s still haven't finished their house. And what goes on? Well, the wealthier men in the society, and I do think some of the women as well, make fun of them. Oh, there goes that destitute man, look at his house. It still doesn't, the roof still isn't finished, because the roof is the big thing. That's the most expensive part of the house. So there is a lot of ridicule and humiliation, and it is strikingly strong.
And then the domino effect, women, if they don't have men to marry, what happens to them?
Well, that's the thing. So legally now in Rwanda, you cannot get married until age 21. In talking to male youth, one official said, look, once a woman is a female youth is 28, she can't, she's not going to get married because then she's an old lady, she's outside of society, she's a prostitute if she has children. It's very condemning.
So that's about a 7-year window.
Actually, when I mentioned that to male youth after that, they said, 28? Are you kidding? Anybody older than 24 or 25 will never get married. So the pressure on these female youth is incredible. I mean, it's extraordinary. And what can they do about it? Well, they drop out of school too, and they work and save money. If they have some money, hopefully a male youth might come to them and say, hey, if we put our money together, we can, buy more roof tiles and finish that house. But for most of them, the chances of them getting married in the proper way is receding.
So what is the official response? You mentioned that housing policy is not keeping up with the needs of the young people in the country. Is the government just turning a blind eye to this? Are they not acknowledging the difficulties that young men and women are facing?
Right. First of all the major findings in the book were confirmed by government officials. I mean, to the point where they were completely obvious. So the problem they have, and we're talking mainly about sort of mid-level government officials, people who know what's going on the ground. When I'd go into that area, before I'd leave that area, I'd brief them on what we found and get their views. And it was always, we know nobody can finish a house. Yeah, we know that. Nobody's becoming an adult. Yes, we know that too. And in the urban areas, the situation is that a lot of these people who can't become adults go into the city because of the sort of the fear of humiliation, and the situation's extremely desperate. And of course, government officials knew that too. So they confirmed it all the major findings. But there are policies about housing that have been made by the president, at the level of the president and ministers, which cannot be challenged. So I think one of the things that happened in speaking with Rwandan government officials is, they can tell me about it, and hopefully, I think the hope was, this was not expressed, but my sense is the hope is that it will be discussed, and the information will get up to the level of high-level officials. Because they can't report this information, that these policies aren't being implemented on the ground, to their supervisors, to the people that they report to.
Fear of delivering bad news?
It appears so, very seriously. And that environment is really what encapsulates the situation, because there isn't, the government officials are stuck too, because they know that the government housing policy can't be met, the regulations, and yet what can they do about it? And they didn't have an answer.
I mean, one of the questions that I had also was that, obviously the government has certain youth priorities, quote unquote, where they focus on, education and they focus on other things, but not necessarily on the priorities, as you mentioned, of the marginalized youth. So how do you think they are supposed to be able to bring those two together in terms of dealing with, yes, the youth has to be educated, but also for those youth that are out of school that are in the urban areas, as well as in the rural ones, indeed, because it seems that there's this dichotomy, where they don't seem to kind of deal with the other side of the coin, if you will.
Yeah, well, I think in this way, I think the Rwandan government officials are very similar to officials in other parts of not just Africa, but other places, whereas, they're educated. The officials are educated. Their role is to, they use words like sensitize the youth, mobilize the youth. The youth lack development, okay? They resist progress. These are the kinds of ways.
So it's their fault.
Well, and so the view of government officials basically is to be coercive, and that doesn't take into account, as you say, the priorities of youth, which is, for male youth, drop out of primary school in many cases to work to try to save enough money to build this roof, it's very difficult to do. The government also, the regulation is that they're all supposed to put their houses in these community housing areas. And that's almost impossible. And the regulations are, I think, a government official was saying, a youth under normal situation can build a house of a certain size. But the government regulations demand that the house must be built in these community housing areas 6 times that size. It's not going to be done. It can't be done. And the officials know it.
You describe a very frustrating scenario, and you talked about losing an entire generation.
Yeah.
What does that play out? What are some of the specific dysfunctions that occur from this, or causes? You talked about urbanization being one of the byproducts of this phenomena. What else? And urbanization in and of itself is not necessarily a problem, but what are some of the problems that manifest as a result of this failure to make the transition from youth to adult?
Well, to say about urbanization, one of the things that's happening is, Rwanda had the highest rate of urbanization, annual urbanization in the world for about 10 straight years. It's now number 2 to Burundi. So urbanization is a big deal.
But still the majority of the population lives in rural
Yes, they do. I think, we can look at this in different ways. I mean, male youth have to continue trying to, this futile, sad kind of objective to try to build a house if they stay in the rural areas. They must do that. They must try to finish it. For female youth, it's really tragic because their life is in one of embarrassment because they're not married when they pass 24, 25, 28. They have children quite often. They're living with their family, but it's an embarrassment. It's shameful. And for the guys, it's much more of a public embarrassment because they're being ridiculed. I didn't find nearly as much female youth being ridiculed per se by not becoming, married within that very narrow framework. But guys, talk a lot about getting made fun of. I think another thing that happens, it's clear that drinking happens with guys. It's clear, and drinking is something I think that is misunderstood. If you make some money, you can feel temporarily like a man. If you go into a bar, they sell banana beer, for example, and you say, okay, I'm going to buy everybody a drink. And you're a man for a moment, and so that's important. But fatalism is something, having such low expectations for life was shocking and tragic in the research. And the fatalism has to do with also their attitudes towards HIV/AIDS, and the research strongly suggests that the HIV/AIDS rate in Rwanda is significantly higher than the official estimates.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the questions, you talk about this fatalism, one of the questions you ask in your interviews was about your plans for improving the situation. Did you find any glimmers of hope in that discourse? Did people have interesting ideas, ways to break the cycle, or is it as depressing as it sounds?
There were, especially male youth, who had some ideas. Male youth mentioned in rural areas that the government could help them. I mean, this is one of the tragedies is that youth would say, we want the government to be close to us. Mm-hmm. And certainly the government wanted that. But the government wants them to join associations. And they don't want to join associations. Mm-hmm. They have to build this house on their own. And there's not a lot of trust. So that's a failed policy. It's not working on the broad way. So, what are these young people doing in these situations? I think these situations, they're kind of getting atomized, feeling sort of a struggle sort of inside of themselves. And it is sad. It is sad. But there were some guys who had plans, okay, the government's going to give me this or whatever, and then they had a plan, but not much of that.
Mom, how representative is this of the problems that youth face across the continent? How unique is this to Rwanda versus what you see?
I think it's not unique to Rwanda. I think in reading Mark's book and also some of the concept paper he's done and the paper he's doing for our conference, it's this what he describes as the transition between youth and adulthood, of childhood and adulthood, which is youth. I think as a young African, I do experience that, not at the level of Rwanda, but in terms of being seen as an adult, because and there are different steps that need to be in place before I can be fully considered an adult. I need to have a job, and it's also different as male and female youth as well. I need to have a job, need to be married and have children, and I think I would fully be seen. Yes, it's Mom Hadi, she's older, but I would be fully seen as an adult. And also there's urban versus rural, and how I think in West Africa, you also get where, you have, an elite and non-elite youth as well. So there are many components here that need to be considered when talking about youth. And, as elite, there are a different set of, steps that you have to go through. And as non-elite also, in building a house, in being able to, and I think as youth, we are expected to also, help our parents because they raised us, and so we are, we owe them.
Mark, we only have a couple minutes left, and I don't want to end without getting to some of your recommendations, because you do suggest some things that could be a way out, thinking long term. Give us a quick recap of what you recommend.
Well, international agencies need to, I think, be much more forceful and assertive with the policies. With housing policy, in my view, they need to, it needs to be reversed. There's no question that, and then the restrictions on the informal sector, on petty trading, it makes it so difficult for urban youth to stabilize themselves, much less get ahead in the city. And so these are really punishing policies. And I think the motivation of the government is not to punish, it's to transform. But it's not working, and they need to be either scrapped or reformed very significantly. I also want to say I think that there is something very counterproductive about the international agencies self-censoring themselves in Rwanda with the Rwandan government. There's a lot of that going on. There's a lot of officials that would tell me that privately, that there's a lot of information that they can't share or that's being closed within their agencies. And I think that with a government that in many ways, the Rwandan government, that in many ways is extremely promising, in other ways is extremely self-destructive, with this, trapped youth is a great example of that, that the international agencies and governments and donors in particular need to use their influence much more assertively to help Rwanda really develop in a way that's going to be stable and help all Rwandans move forward.
Well, thank you for this terrific book and for covering an important subject, and thanks for joining us, Mamhadi, for today's discussion. A little business to do before we sign off. This is the book, Stuck, by Mark Summers, but I also, earlier in the program, Mamhadi mentioned the conference that'll be taking place here at the Wilson Center that looks at youth across the continent of Africa and the challenges and problems and potential solutions. If you're interested in that, come to our website, wilsoncenter.org, look at the tab for programs, find the Africa program, and you'll be able to find a recap of what happens here on April 17th. Thanks for joining us. We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.